And when he was old enough, went off from home off to university, and from university it was in Russian universities that he began to associate with the Zionist community and the Zionist cause. He taught himself Hebrew, moved to Paris in 1921, and became a serious Hebrew writer, and then moved to Israel in 1931. He writes a very interesting short story, which I think you will enjoy. So let me put it up here on the screen. The story is called The Sermon. And the setting of this, it's just a short story, but it is such a classic expression of this dual effect of Zionism, to be both a recovery and a rebellion. It's about a little guy whose name is Yudka. Now, Yudka is the Russian sort of affectionate equivalent of Yehuda, which means the Jew. And he is a kibbutznik. And in those days, this is in the 40s, you can see the kibbutz was a highly ideological community. When I visited kibbutz in the 1970s, it was still highly ideological. And every week there was a kibbutz meeting. But in the 40s, it was great, because in the 40s, the kibbutz meetings were these raucous, long arguments about the ideology of socialism, the ideology of Zionism, and ideology was so very, very important. So in the middle of this meeting, Yudka, who's not an intellectual, he's just a farmhand, he's just a working guy, he gets up and he says, "I'd like to make a statement." And they put him off to the end of the meeting. They put him off and they put him off and they put him off. Finally, they can't ignore him anymore. The meeting's come to an end. And Yudka says, "I'd like to make my statement now." And they say, "Okay, Boychik, get up and make your statement." And this is the statement. This is the sermon by Chaim Chazaz, written in Hebrew, 1943, on the eve of the creation of the state. He says, "I want to state that I am opposed to Jewish history. I will begin with the fact that we have no history at all. It's a fact, because we didn't make our own history. The Goyim made it for us. Just as they used to put out our candles on Shabbat, milk our cows, and light our ovens on Shabbat, because we're Shabbos Goys, right? So they made our history for us to suit themselves, and we took it from them as it came. They forced it on us, whether we liked it or not. What's in our history? What's there? Oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom, and again, oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom, and again without end. What's in it? It bores you to death. It's just dull. Now, here in Palestine, our children love to read, unless they're stupid. I know this for a fact. I've looked into it. Yes, they read, but historical novels about Goyim, not about Jews. Why is that so? It's no accident. It's simply because Jewish history is dull, uninteresting. It has no glory, no action, no heroes, no conquerors, no rulers or masters of their fate, just a collection of wounded, hunted, groaning, wailing wretches, always begging for mercy. I would simply forbid teaching our children Jewish history. Why the devil teach them about their ancestors' shame? I would say to them, boys, from the day we were driven out from our land, we've been a people without history, class dismiss, God, and play football. And then he says, I know that there's some glory in suffering, but what glory is there really? And finally, look how he ends this story. To my mind, if I'm right, Zionism and Judaism are not at all the same, but two things quite different from each other, and maybe two things directly opposite each other. At any rate, far from the same. When a man can no longer be a Jew, he becomes a Zionist. Zionism begins with the wreckage of Judaism, from the point where the strength of the people fails. That's a fact. Nobody has yet begun to understand Zionism. It is far deeper, far more pregnant with vast and fateful consequences than appears on the surface or that people say. Chaim Chazaz presents an element, of a version of Zionism, which in many ways captures the Zionism of the 1940s, probably the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, even into the 1960s. When you're tired of being a Jew, you become a Zionist. Meaning when you're tired of the story of our persecution, tired of the story of our oppression, tired of the weakness and impotence of the Jewish people, you join the Zionist cause. And Zionism is a recovery of a strong Jew, of a powerful Jew, of a Jew who can create the conditions of her, his own experience and his own existence. And that Zionism was a rebellion against what they perceived as Judaism. Now, I'll give you an example of this, and then I'd like to read the philosopher who is really the soul of this idea that Zionism and Israel were created for the purpose of creating a new Jew, a new Jewish culture, a different Jewish culture, and a break from the Jewish culture that was so common in Eastern Europe and in the diaspora. One of the really interesting examples of this and the wrestling with this idea is the story of the Yad Vashem Museum in Jerusalem. I don't know how many of you have ever been to the Yad Vashem Museum. And the question really is, which Yad Vashem did you come to? You see, Yad Vashem was built in the 50s, was started around the time of the Eichmann trial. And the building that you visited in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s and even into the 1980s was a low-slung, long building, like a long bungalow. And as you walked into that building, you realized that there were two exhibits, one on each side of the wall, and it just followed. On one side of the wall was a historical diorama that talked about the rise of the Third Reich in Germany, its vicious and horrifying anti-Semitism, and its efforts to exterminate and murder the Jews of the world, and its success, alas, in destroying 6 million Jewish souls. That was the story on one side. Opposite that, the same length of space was the story of all of the resistance, of the ghetto fighters, of the rebellions in the concentration camp, of the commandos who parachuted in from Israel to save Jews of Eastern Europe. And the name of the museum was a memorial to Shoah Ugvura. Shoah means destruction, Holocaust, and Gvura means bravery, resistance, power. It was the notion that we were no longer going to embrace and celebrate our weakness, our impotence, and that the Holocaust for the Zionist story at that point was the epitome of weakness, of galut weakness, of diaspora impotence, of the passivity of the Jew in the face of the conditions of exile, and that Israel represented a rebellion against that. And what the museum beckoned you to do was, as you were going down the diorama, looking at the history of the Third Reich, it kept asking you to turn around. Don't read that story. Don't celebrate that. Turn around to the other story. That was what Yad Vashem was. Now, later in the 1990s, a new Yad Vashem was built. And I don't know if you've been to this one. This is a very different museum. It's a much more sophisticated museum. It's a much bigger museum. Moshe Safdie, the famous architect, designed the building. But this museum is a very different museum because this museum tells a very different story. And the story that this museum tells recognizes that there was resistance, but it wasn't always armed resistance. There was other qualities of Jewishness that survived the camps and the ghettos, other qualities of Jewishness that survived the Nazi onslaught that need to be celebrated as well. And what's remarkable in this new museum are the dioramas. They have these giant television screens with testimonies from those who survived, talking about how we survived the ghetto, how we survived in the camp. And not just physical survival, but how we kept our minds, how it was that a Jewish mother would find milk for her children and teach her kids a few Yiddish words, how it was that in one particular barracks of the concentration camp, they taught a bar mitzvah class and celebrated Jewish holidays, the kind of spiritual resistance. It recognized a different form of strength, a different form of Jewish courage than the old Yad Vashem celebrated. In other words, this question of what is Israeli identity and how does it relate to Jewish identity is something that's still being debated to this day. And in the cultural expressions that we've looked at in art and in music, and soon we'll do it in literature and film, you can see how this question of identity is being worked out, is being wrestled with. Or let's take a step back from the Holocaust, back from Chaim Chazaz, and let's go back to the end of the 19th century. The end of the 19th century. And I'd like to introduce you to the godfather of Israeli culture. His pen name, if you know Israeli literature, is Achad Ha'am. His real name was Asher Zvi Ginsberg, born in Odessa, in the Ukraine. In case you didn't get it, by the way, if you've been listening to the news this last week, all of the places they've been talking about are places that were once great centers of Jewish life. Kiev and Odessa and Kharkov and Lvov and all these places. Asher Zvi Ginsberg was born in a ghetto and came to Odessa as a young man. He was what you called an Ilui. He was a Talmudic genius, memorized all of Jewish literature, all the Talmud by the time he was 12 years old. And because he was such a genius and already memorized all of Talmud by the time he was 12, he asked for the keys to the local library and they gave it to him. So he taught himself European languages and started reading through European culture. He read philosophy. He read science. He read literature. And then he comes to Odessa as a young man and joins the Zionist circle and soon becomes the guiding light of the Zionist circle of Odessa. Odessa is a resort city on the Black Sea, great, beautiful city to this day. God willing, it survives. He involves himself in the international Zionist movement, but he's very disappointed. He's very disappointed with Theodor Herzl. He's very disappointed with all of the Zionist leaders because he thinks they don't get it. They don't understand the real task of Zionism. Herzl wanted to build a Jewish state because Herzl recognized that there was anti-Semitism everywhere. And if we don't get Jews out of Europe, they won't survive. Physically, they won't survive. Herzl, his contemporary, saw the Shoah in his nightmares. Ahad Ha'am recognized this well, that there were political needs, but that wasn't the principal problem. The principal problem that Ahad Ha'am recognized, that Asher Zvi Ginsberg recognized, was the stagnation and destruction of Jewish culture. Something happened to Jewish culture over the 2,000 years of our experience in diaspora that needed to be remedied, that needed to be fixed. Something happened to the character of the Jewish people that needed to be fixed. Galut, exile, being away from our natural state of being, had seeped into our being and twisted and turned us into people that were hardly recognizable as healthy, normal human beings. And so what Zionism was for Asher Zvi Ginsberg, for Ahad Ha'am, was a remedy to the disease of galut, the disease of exile, the disease of diaspora. Let's read a little bit of his work. 1894. He writes an essay called The People of the Book. Now, the people of the book is something we're proud of, right? We're all proud of being the people of the book, not him. And you'll recognize there's a sort of character type here. He's a curmudgeon. He's a grumpy old guy. He's an angry, before he was old, he was a grumpy old guy. The relation between a normal people and its literature is one of parallel development and mutual interaction. Literature responds to the demands of life, and life reacts to the guidance of literature. The function of literature is to plant the seed of new ideas and new desires. The seed once planted, life does the rest. So he's thinking about philosophy. He's thinking about literature. He's thinking about science. He's thinking about poetry. He's reading all the great philosophers, and he notices the way that the great philosophers are inspiring new ways of being. And then he says, but a people of the book, unlike a normal people, is a slave to the book. This people has surrendered its whole soul to the written word. The book ceases to be what it should be, a source of ever new inspiration and moral strength. On the contrary, its function in life is to weaken and finally to crush all spontaneity of action and emotion until men become wholly dependent on the written word and incapable of responding to any stimulus in nature or human life without its permission and approval. And not even when the sanction is found is the response simple and natural. It has to follow a prearranged and artificial plan. He quotes a play. It's a very famous play by the playwright Israel Zangwill. Israel Zangwill was also a Jew like Ahad Ha'am, raised in a religious world, who broke out in order to enjoy the fruits of modernity. And Zangwill writes a play, and here's the plot of the play. There's two lovely little kids are playmates, and they're playing in the backyard. And one day when they're playing in the yard, he puts a ring on her finger and says to the kid, Hareyat mikudeshetli. In other words, he puts a ring on his 7, 8, 10-year-old playmate finger and says the words that you say at a Jewish wedding, which bind a husband and a wife, a bride and a groom. And somebody witnesses this. 20 years go by, and the girl is about to get married to the boy of her dreams. And as the boy of her dreams is about to put the ring on her finger, somebody rushes up and stops the ceremony and says, no, you can't do that. She's already married to what's his name. He said, what do you mean she's married to what's his name? I saw that when she was 7 years old, she did this. And the problem here is that the groom is a Kohen. And even if she were divorced, the 7-year-old boyfriend that she was married to 20 years earlier, she couldn't marry him. And the whole thing ends in tragedy. It ends in a tragedy. Ahad Ha'am says this is indicative of something. It's indicative of a people that has surrendered its soul, its creative juices, its creative life to the book. It just follows the book. And there's two principal reasons why this has happened, he said. First reason is because we only talk to ourselves. Because Jewish life, at least in Eastern Europe, has become so insular that we do not respond to cultures outside. We do not respond to the cultural world outside. We're only talking to ourselves. And when we're only talking to ourselves, we get very stagnant. A culture thrives when it's in conversations with other cultures. Judaism thrived when it was in conversation with other cultures. When we were in conversations with Hellenism, we produced the Talmudic literature. When we were in conversation with Arabic philosophy, we produced Maimonides. When we were in conversation with European mysticism, we produced the Zohar. But for the last 500 years, it's only us. And we have no conversation. And there's no juices flowing through this culture. And the other problem, he said, is that we're only talking about a few issues. We have given over to the secular government, in this case, the Russians, or the Ukrainians, but it was Russians at that time, control over all the really important issues. They collect the trash and they police the neighborhood and they do war and peace. And what do we deal with? I'll give you a funny example of this. I have a friend who's a big rabbi in Israel. And he came to me once, he says, I have a present for you. I said, yeah, really? I have a book. A book, really? It's written by my uncle. You have a book written by your uncle? Yeah, he lives in Bnei Brak. Anyone ever been to Bnei Brak? It's the super Orthodox neighborhood outside of Tel Aviv. Me'er Sharim is the neighborhood in Yerushalayim. This is Bnei Brak, which is near Tel Aviv, Petach Tikva, near Petach Tikva. And it was a bestseller, this book. It was called Kol Bo Al Shloch Monis. Translation, 400 pages of meditation and reflection and halakha about the custom of delivering humantashen to your neighbors. Says, can you imagine this? The genius of the Jewish mind devoted to what? To war and peace, to the distribution of healthcare, to the ethics of policing, to the ethics of economics, of income inequality, to environmental crisis. No. 400 pages dealing with how you're supposed to deliver humantash to your neighbors. He says, there's something wrong with this. This is what Ahad Ha'am was talking about. This is the isolation and the insulation of Jewish culture, of Jewish genius. Number one, from the true issues that the world demands that we deal with. And number two, from a conversation with other cultures. And this, he says, this is our problem. So what is it we must do? Let's take a look inside. We Jews have been a people of the book in this sense for nearly 2,000 years. Well, let's go back just a bit. He says, the people of the book stand still from age to age. Little or nothing changes because the vital impulse to change is lacking on both sides. The people stagnates because heart and mind do not react directly immediately to external events. The book stagnates because the result of this absence of direct reaction, heart and mind do not rise and revolt against the written word, which has ceased to be in harmony with current needs. We've been this kind of people for 2,000 years, but this is not always so. The paramount question is whether there's any possibility of curing this long-standing disease, whether the Jewish people can still shake off its inertia, regain direct contact with the actualities of life, and yet remain the Jewish people. That's the question. You see, the question is, how do you engage in a cultural conversation with outside cultures without giving into assimilation, without becoming them? How do you maintain the true authenticity of your own culture, but enter into conversation with the outside? We must revitalize the idea of a national renaissance. You see that phrase? That's the phrase. For Achad Ha'am, Israel, the creation of a state of Israel wasn't to protect us from anti-Semitism. That was Herzl's problem. For Achad Ha'am, by having our own land, a place where we will be a cultural majority, a place where we'll gather up our own cultural resources, we will create a national renaissance and use every means possible to strengthen its hold and deepen its roots until it becomes an organic element in the Jewish consciousness. Organic meaning growing, thriving, living, and an independent dynamic force. Only that way can the Jewish soul be freed from its shackles and regain contact with the broad stream of human life, without having to pay for its freedom by sacrificing its individuality. So here is the problem. If it takes contact with the outside world in order to remain a healthy culture, growing culture, developing culture, creative culture, how do you do that without assimilating into that outside world? That's the problem. And the only way that he could think about doing it was going back to your land, because there was something romantic about living on the land, regaining contact with your language. Remember, he's writing in Hebrew. His Hebrew, by the way, is like exquisite. It's like Shakespearean Hebrew is what it is. It's not modern Hebrew. It's a very different kind of Hebrew. It's Melitzidic Hebrew. The whole notion of recovering Hebrew was his idea. And it was his student, Eliezer ben Yehuda, who started doing it. You understand, nobody spoke Hebrew in the world. Nobody spoke Hebrew in the world from the time of the Mishnah in 200 CE, and even then they spoke Aramaic and Greek. Nobody spoke Hebrew. They spoke Yiddish, they spoke Ladino, they spoke Judeo-Persian, they spoke Judeo-Arabic, but nobody spoke Hebrew until Eliezer ben Yehuda, a Achad Ha'am student, started reviving the language. And he had an interesting thing, by the way. He had a simple rule. He told his kids, "Rak be'ivrit." You could only speak Hebrew in the house, which meant that he had to make up words for things we didn't have words for. Like, what's the Hebrew word for a vacuum cleaner? The answer is vacuum, but he had a better word for it. Electricity, chashmal. You got that word from the prophet Ezekiel. He went looking for roots. He went creating words. Eliezer ben Yehuda writes a dictionary and recreates the Hebrew language. The fact that people speak Hebrew today, just think about this. This language was dead. This language was dead. And suddenly he brings this language back. And that's what's remarkable. Achad Ha'am lives in Odessa, but in 1922, he makes Aliyah to Israel and moves to Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. Now think about that a minute. And if you've been to Israel, you know why. Jerusalem is a city that lives in the past and the future. Jerusalem is a city that drips with history. Every street corner is history. Every building has a history. Every vista is about history. And every dream is about the Mashiach, the Messiah coming. Tel Aviv looks very different. It's a different architecture. It's a different spirit. Tel Aviv is a city that lives in the present tense. Tel Aviv is the first Hebrew city, meaning it's not a Jewish city. It's a Hebrew city. It's a city that reflects this new idea. It's outward facing to Europe. It's outward facing to the Americas. These days, it's outward facing to Asia. And it's engaging those cultures in a conversation. Ahad Ha'am becomes an official for the Tel Aviv school district to try to imagine what a new curriculum might be for Jewish culture in Jewish school district. Ahad Ha'am is one of the sponsors of a Jewish opera company. Now, just take that for a minute. We never had a Jewish opera. What's a Jewish opera? You can go to Tel Aviv, by the way, and see this. There's an Israeli art museum in Tel Aviv. Now you'll do what I did, because what do I know from art? I'm an Aretz when it comes to art. You'll walk to the art museum and say, what's Israeli or Jewish about this? But that's exactly the question that Ahad Ha'am wanted us to ask, because only in conversation with the world of art that we can create art that is expressive of our own internal cultural yearnings, our own internal cultural perceptions. It's only in that conversation. Habima Theater Company is in Tel Aviv. The dance company is in Tel Aviv. The theater companies, all of the great cultural arts are located in Tel Aviv because they're part of Ahad Ha'am's conversation with the outside world. That's exactly who he is. Oh, and by the way, you'll appreciate this. Anybody here drink tea? Anybody here drink tea? Anyone ever drink Vysotsky tea? The Vysotsky family was the biggest tea manufacturers and importers in Russia. And when Ahad Ha'am couldn't make a living as a Zionist activist, David Vysotsky hired him and made him an official of the Vysotsky Tea Company. He was the world's worst tea salesman, but he was one of the great Zionist philosophers. So next time you drink a glass of Vysotsky tea, toast Ahad Ha'am. Let's take a look at another one of his essays. In 1897, Theodor Herzl gathers world Zionist leaders to create the first Zionist Congress. They meet in Basel, Switzerland, and the topic of the Congress is, let's begin the political movement that will move the Jewish people to its own independent state in the land of Palestine. It was a political statement. Ahad Ha'am was a delegate to that conversation, but typically he was a curmudgeon, and he didn't like Herzl, and he didn't like Herzl's guys, and he didn't like Herzl's vision, because he saw something deeply problematic in Herzl's vision. Herzl missed the point. Here's his essay in response to Herzl's vision. Herzl writes a famous book called The Jewish State. Ahad Ha'am responds by saying, there's a different problem. It's the Jewish state and the Jewish problem. The Eastern form of the spiritual problem is absolutely different from the West. In the West, that is in Western Europe, where Herzl came from, he's from Austria, it is the problem of the Jews, that is, Jews facing anti-Semitism. But in the East, it is the problem of Judaism. The first, that is the West, weighs on the individual Jew who cannot make it in secular society, in non-Jewish society, even though he has been assimilated and even though he has been emancipated, and even though he wears Western garb and speaks fluent French or fluent English or fluent German, he'll never be accepted. That's the problem of the West. The second is on the nation. The whole country is a problem. The whole community is a problem. The one is felt by Jews who've had European education. That's Herzl. The other by Jews whose education has been Jewish. In other words, he feels that Herzl Zionism doesn't really understand the real needs of Eastern European Jews, who are, after all, the majority of Jews in the world, and the majority of Jews who supported Zionism. The one is the product of anti-Semitism, is dependent on anti-Semitism for its existence. The other is the natural product of real life with a millennial culture, and it will remain unsolved and unaffected, even if the troubles of all the Jews all over the world attain comfortable economic positions and are on the best possible terms with their neighbors and are admitted to the fullest social and political equality. In other words, even if you were to solve all of the problems, even if you were to solve all of the problems of the Jewish people, even if every Jew in the world lived in a comfortable home and had a comfortable existence and a comfortable living, you would not solve the problem, says Echad Ha'am, because the problem isn't about anti-Semitism. The problem is about something else. It is not only the Jews who have to come out of the ghetto. Judaism has to come out. That's the line. For the Jews, the exodus from the ghetto confined to certain countries due to toleration, but Judaism has to come out, or it is coming out, whenever it comes into contact with modern culture. And that is his question. Can we bring Jewish culture into contact, into conversation? Can we create fundamentally a new kind of Judaism, a Judaism which is in organic relationship with the outside world, growing and developing and reaching to new things? He says Judaism is in a quandary. It can no longer tolerate the galut form which it has taken on in obedience to its will to live when it was exiled from its own country. But without that form, its life is in danger. The problem is that once you leave the ghetto, you leave the strictures that protected you, not politically protect you, but culturally protected you from assimilation and from self-doubt. For the purpose of creating this national renaissance that he foresaw, Judaism can, for present, content itself with very little. It does not need its own, it does not need a state, but only the creation in its native land of conditions favorable to its development, a good-sized settlement of Jews working without hindrance in every branch of civilization, from agricultural to handicrafts to science and literature. See, unlike Herzl, who wanted a state, Herzl said we don't need a state. We don't need government. We don't need an army. We just need a place. He foresaw an Israel which would not be a state, but rather a cultural center, or rather, he wanted to begin with a cultural center. And then eventually, if we needed the accoutrements of statehood, we could gather those up. We could have the accoutrements of statehood. But he had a problem with this. And the problem he had with this is something very, very interesting, and I think very apropos of this moment in the development of Zionism. Let me read you one more paragraph, and then we'll finish, right? He says, when our national culture in Palestine has attained that level, that is a level where we are truly growing as a culture, creating art, creating music, creating literature, creating our own forms of expression that express the deep national character of the Jewish people and the deep experience of the Jewish people. When national culture in Palestine has attained that level, we may be confident that it will produce people in the land of Israel who will be able at that favorable moment to establish a state. But one which is not just the state of the Jews, but really a Jewish state. A Jewish state. And this was his critique of Herzl. You want to gather up all the Jews and save them from anti-Semitism. I understand that. But if you just gather up all the Jews and save them from anti-Semitism, you're not going to have a Jewish state. You know what you're going to have? Beverly Hills. Because Beverly Hills has a majority of Jews. Did you know that? Calabasas apparently does too, right? But that's not what we want. We want something else. We want a country. We want a state, we want a community that is both supportive of this deep inner spirit of the Jewish people as it creates itself and generating new forms of Jewish culture, growing again, living again in the way we did during the biblical times and even during rabbinic times. And here's his warning. And here he becomes very critical. So listen, hang on for a minute. A political ideal, which is not grounded in our national culture, is apt to seduce us from loyalty to our own inner spirit and to beget in us a tendency to find the path of glory in the attainment of material power and political domination, thus breaking the thread that unites us with the past and undermines its historic foundations. You know, you build a state too soon. You build a state without building the culture that goes in it. You build a state without truly developing that national renaissance. You build a state without truly figuring out its political theory. You build a state without truly understanding what a Jewish state might mean, and it's going to end up looking like every other country, because you're going to fall in love with the flag, and you're going to fall in love with armaments that have Jewish stars painted on the side, and you're going to fall in love with all of the accoutrements of statehood, and you're going to leave behind the really hard work of figuring out what exactly is Jewish art? What exactly is Jewish music? What exactly is Jewish literature? What exactly is Jewish about Jewish theater? What is exactly Jewish about Israel? That is the question he wanted us to ask. And that's a question that is being asked in Israel now in a very wonderful, wonderful way. And that, my friends, is what we're seeing in these lectures that we've experienced so far. The lectures, Sagi Raphael's lectures on Israeli art and Dani Massing's lectures on Israeli music. You can see a culture which is grappling, wrestling, trying to figure this out. Who are we in this 21st century as a Jewish people? And what does it mean now that we have sovereignty in our own land? What are the things that we're now in a position to create that we could never have created before? And how glorious is it to listen to music and to say it's Hebrew, but it sounds an awful like American hip hop music, or to see art and say it looks like a Jewish knockoff of European art, but then slowly to be able to see, no, there's something really Jewish here. There's something really Jewish here. I'll finish with one observation, and then I'd love to discuss this with you if you'd like. There's a television program. There was, I don't think it's on anymore. It was when I was living in Israel, which was some time ago, called Mabat. It's a news program that comes on 9 o'clock in the evening. It's a combination of Nightline, 60 Minutes, and the World Wrestling Federation. And what happens is you focus in, you have a studio which is made up of two tables with a rostrum in the middle. And the guy at the rostrum is one of the newscasters for Israeli television. And he's the only man in the state of Israel that owns a nice suit, right? No other Israeli owns this. Even Bennett doesn't own a good suit. And, so he's wearing this gorgeous suit, a lovely man with a very good voice. Shalom, shalom, erev tov, and he presents a problem. And on each side, in each table, it's a debate on how to deal with this issue. And it doesn't matter what the issue is. It can be income inequality, the health system. It can be what to do with refugees who sneak into Israel. It could be the decline of the kibbutz. It could be the problems they're having with education. On it, whatever problem they're having that week in Israel, they take it up and they have, the two sides. So I happened to be there. There's 60,000 African refugees living in South Tel Aviv. And there's a huge debate going on in Israel. There was some years ago about what to do with these people. They snuck over from Ethiopia and from Darfur. They snuck in, literally walked across the Sinai desert, like we did once, and snuck into Israel. The kibbutzim on the border took them in, right? But then there were more than they could take in. So they ended up going into Tel Aviv. And there are parts of Tel Aviv now that you walk around and it's like little Africa. It's a strange place. And the question is, do we send them back to the places they came? Or do we allow them to live in Israel and become citizens? What do you do with these people? But that's only one issue. It could be all the other issues: health, environment, policing, income inequality, all the other issues. And on one side, you'll have an Israeli government bureaucrat, wrinkled black slacks, white shirt open at the collar, squeaky voice, saying, we're only 7 million people here in this country. How could we take in refugees? We're not in a position. And then on the other side, you have the Israeli activist who screams, but we have a humanitarian obligation. And then at one point, about 3/4 through the show, half an hour show, the question is always comes to the same point. They each look at each other and say, Aval anachnu medina yehudit. It's true that there are practicalities to be taught about here. And it's true that other countries would do it differently. And it's true, and it's true, and it's true, but we're the Jewish state. And the question is, what does that mean? We're the Jewish state. What is expected of us as a state, as a national political entity, as a community? And what is expected of his people, the citizens of that country? And what is it that Israel creates in terms of culture? And that question of what it means to be not just Jewish, which is something that we spent 2,000 years thinking about. There's a vast literature of Talmud on what it means to be Jewish, but we've only begun to think about what it means to be Jewish and a resident, a citizen, an adherent, an advocate for Jewish sovereignty, for a Jewish state. Ahad Ha'am said we need a national renaissance, but more than that, we need a national conversation about what this cultural revolution means, because we're creating a new Jew in a new circumstance. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the background to the whole conversation we've been having in our course. So thank you for listening tonight. I apologize again that Jonathan Estjikin wasn't able to be with us. We pray that he's healthy and well and we can have him soon. Why don't we take a moment now, and if anybody has questions, I will remove the spotlight and turn on the gallery. And if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to answer your questions. You either can wave your hand wildly or put them in the chat, and I'd be happy, or you can hit the little hand raise thing where it says reactions, and I'd be happy to try and answer questions. If anyone has any questions, this is your last chance to ask a rabbi a question, and it's free. Otherwise, it's expensive. Lael Rubin, good morning. How are you? You have to unmute, please. If you'll unmute, I can answer your question.
I was going to say it's good evening, Rabbi, but we'll say
in Israel it's morning. In Israel it's morning. That's why I'm.
Yeah. So my question is, putting on your prophet hat, where do you think this is going, and what would you say would be the conversation on this subject a year from now?
Oh, that is such a wonderful question. I don't know about a year from now. I'm interested in 20 years from now. The Ahad Ha'am, I think, pegged the problem exactly right. In order to be a growing culture, in order to be a developing culture, in order to stay vibrant, alive, and vital, a culture has to be in conversation with other cultures, right? But the problem is that when you enter into conversation with other cultures, when you leave the ghetto, the cultural ghetto, the walls that protected us from everybody else's ideas, and you start listening to everybody else's ideas, you start listening to everybody else's music, you start listening to everybody else's culture, you run the risk of assimilation, which is we tend to, our own national spirit gets drowned out by the global culture that's all around us, right? And what's so interesting about that in this particular cultural moment is exactly what we're doing right now. There was, even before COVID, a global culture, a global media culture. But with the advent of social media, now that global culture is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. You can't get away from it. I mean, there's some really funny stories about how, children in the most remote villages in the most underdeveloped countries are, want to know what's the next episode of the latest television program being broadcast in America, because everyone is connected to everyone else. Now, the question is, given a global culture, is there something left of the spark of Jewishness in us that won't get assimilated out? Right. So remember our first lecture, Professor Melissa Weininger was our guest, and she presented some wonderful just examples of the sort of frontiers of Israeli culture. And one of the things she presented us was a very goofy musical video called Shake Your Boom Boom, which is put out by a group of Israeli hip hop artists. And now part of it's in Hebrew. Okay. If you sing American hip hop in Hebrew, is that Jewish culture? And that's the question. So, and is that going to drown us out? Now, you can go back in Jewish history and find examples where we assimilated musical forms from other cultures, right? Just about every melody for every prayer that you and I associate as traditional was once a revolution, and everybody walked out of shul because they had no right to change the melodies. Right? Even Shema Yisrael Adonai, that was written by somebody, right? Somebody wrote every one of those melodies, usually Italian. There were great Italian composers, and there were great French composers and great Germans and great Polish composers using, and all the melodies are made up, right? They were taken from the outside. The question is, what remains of us? So the question is, will there be an Israeli culture in 20 years, or will Israeli culture simply be an American knockoff? In Israel, for example, there's a really interesting conversation going on about language. Because if you open an Israeli newspaper, all these words are simply transliterated English words. Haim yesh demokratia b'midata yehudit. Is there democracy here? I mean, there's all these words now, and there's so much English being spoken in Israel. There's a question about whether Hebrew is even going to survive. It's a very wonderful question. And I don't know the answer because I'm not a prophet, but I will tell you that it is a remarkable experience to watch it being played out. And that's why Alana and I wanted this series to happen, because we're just enjoying watching this being played out, right? And that's really where we are now. So I hope, Ahad Ha'am was convinced that there was something called the Jewish spirit. And he was a Russian romantic. And the Russian romantics, had this idea that every nation has its own spirit. Hegel had the same idea. And there was some deep Jewishness in all of us that would be expressed once we had the opportunity to do it. And I'm in my optimistic modes, I kind of agree with that. There's something Jewish that will come out of us, that is something new and exciting and deeply authentic Jewishness. And that's what I'm hoping for. That's as much of a prophet as I intend to be tonight. Okay. Lois Weinsauf, good evening. Please unmute. Your turn. And then Elise, you're next.
I didn't have Jonathan. A question. I just wanted to comment how prescient both of them were.
Yeah.
It's too bad that Herzl, wasn't 50 years earlier, because maybe our history would have been completely different. But in Ahad Ha'am, in the paragraph, I think it was the second paragraph of his piece, where he talks about what will be without a state, sounds like describing American Jewry.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, he saw the future also.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. We are the freest diaspora community there has ever been. And we are the most threatened. I mean, that's the irony. My ancestors, your ancestors, were spiritually free, but politically worried. Right? My grandfather was worried that the Russians would come and kidnap him, and the pogroms would come and burn the village, right? But he was never worried that his grandchildren would be Jewish. I am no worry that my kids are politically or physically unsafe, but I worry about the state of their souls. That's the irony of American diaspora. Okay, so we're living in a moment of two revolutions. We're living in the first generations of Jewish sovereignty in 2,000 years. And we're living in the generation of the greatest, freest, most prosperous, most powerful diaspora in 2,000 years. And the question is, what kind of culture, what kind of expressions of Jewishness will we create out of these two environments? And that's what makes this moment of our history so remarkable. That's why I'm glad God let me be born now. It's a remarkable moment in our history. Just a remarkable moment in our history. Elise, good morning. How are you?
Okay, well, I'm actually here in Encino, so it's nighttime.
Yes, but in Israel, it's morning, so I want you to know. Go ahead.
Okay, no, I'll be in Israel in 2 weeks. Thank you, God willing.
Amen.
Please forgive me if I have misunderstood something.
Go ahead.
But when we were talking about the Africans coming into Israel, I was also there. And I was there when they were protesting because they didn't want to leave. They had children that were already born in Israel and that wanted to, that they know nothing else and speak Hebrew. They believe that they should be staying. The uprise from the Israelis was because we are a Jewish nation. How can a Jew turn away the other? And I couldn't understand the nexus between what Hannah was saying or what Herzl was saying, but I did want to point out that it's because we are Jewish, because it is a Jewish state, that we have to keep those borders open. And that is the conflict there today.
Yeah, right. And that was, I'm just use that as an example of one issue that faces Israel, and that the conversation has all these practicalities and all of these political realities, but 3/4 of the way into the program, all of that get put aside, and we look at each other and say, but we're a Jewish state. And the question is, what does it mean to be a Jewish state? And you understand exactly why. Because they built this, because they didn't listen to Hara'am. They couldn't. The war came. They built a country. Ben Gurion had a moment when he needed to start the country. He couldn't take 50 years to write a political theory, right? America had some time, right? You know, we had a revolution in 1776, and then years later we wrote a constitution. Israel never had that kind of luxury. So you built a country without a political theory. You built a country without a constitution. You built a country without a sense of exactly what the heck we were doing here. You built a Knesset full of all kinds of different opinions. I don't know if you've ever been to the Knesset, right? It's the world's greatest Jewish dinner table, right? If you think people argue at your dinner, you got to come to the Knesset one day. Woo-wee, right? And because they're arguing, they're trying to figure this out, and they're doing it under duress. Yeah, if we had 50 years of peace and quiet, Alavai,
we could cure cancer.
Yeah, but we'd also cure this problem. But you're exactly right. So the question is, what does it mean to be a Jewish state? That's the question Hara'am wanted us to fight with, because he wanted us to find that Jewishness within and find new ways of expressing it. And that, I think, is a beautiful project. And that's what that's what makes Israeli culture so much fun. Falafel.
This will be forever. This will be for as long as Israel is in existence, for thousands of years to come. And the only other thing I wanted to say is I am politically and physically concerned about my children here in the United States. I am not worried about their spirituality or the neshama.
I'm worried about everything. So that you're a step ahead of me. That's okay.
And that too is a Jewish.
That's okay. That's okay. Jonathan, where are you? You just disappeared. Where'd you go? Jonathan, you here? I saw you on my screen and then it disappeared. Oh gosh, I missed Jonathan.
Did we lose him?
I think I lost Jonathan. All right. Anyone else have?
There's 2 questions in the chat, I believe.
Okay. How is it possible for beta Jews, especially some of us, do not have a voice? We don't have documents. People deny us. Can we find a place? I'm not sure I understand what that question is. So maybe, James, if you'll just email me after the session, I'll be glad to try and answer the question more directly, if that would be okay. Anyone else have a question tonight? Well, then thank you for listening tonight. I apologize for the change in plans. We had a sort of emergency we had to deal with. So please, once again, let me make this announcement. Next week, we will join in person at Valley Beth Shalom to enjoy a presentation by the Jewish Women's Theater, which is now called The Braid. And the Jewish Women's Theater, The Braid, is going to be presenting a program on Israeli-American identity, the stories of American Israeli or Israeli Americans. And be very happy to welcome all of you. There's an admission fee for that, but if anybody finds that difficult, just let us know and we'll make sure that you get in, okay? Because we would very much like to have you there and to celebrate our identity. And then the following week is Purim, right, Nalana? Did I get that right? The following is Purim, so you got to bring a Hamantash and a Grogger and a little bit of schnapps, and we can enjoy a conversation about Haman. I guess this year there's a lot to talk about with bad guys and good guys and the way the world is. And then following that, we'll welcome Rabbi Mishael Sion, who'll be talking to us about the spiritual revival among Israelis, especially non-religious Israelis. So please join us again. Thank you to Ilana Zimmerman. Thank you to Jess and Lil for their constant support. Thank you to all of you for your patience with us as we dealt with this strange circumstance. And let me wish all of you a very good night.
And a Misha Beirach to him.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night, all. Yasher Koach.
Still